I was born in September of 1934. I remember things from when I was 3. We lived in Lansdale. I remember going to my friend's house who lived down the street and being afraid to go because there were 2 husky dogs on one side, on the left side of the street, that were fenced in, and they were always barking, and I was always afraid they'd get out. And then on the other side of the street, there was a house set way, way back, and we thought a witch lived there. So when I went down the street, I had to walk down the middle of the street, walk or run, all the way down to Jimmy's house. And we had other friends who lived across the street from us. They were the Krupps, and I forget the children's names. But there was a friend that was about Lynn's age and a friend about my age, and we were over there playing lots of times, many times. And this one time, I saw my dad come out of the house and sit on the front porch. And I was so excited to see him, I ran home, ran across the street without looking, and a car was coming, and Daddy jumped up and screamed at me. The car did not hit me.
Thank goodness. Were you allowed on your own just to kind of walk around town at 3 years old back then?
Local within the area, we had a lot of freedom.
Wow.
We didn't go off our street, like I would run down the street to visit Jimmy, but he was just 3-4 houses away, and across the street were the Krupps. So we had friends right close. But Lynn was 3 years older than I was, is 3 years older than I am. And so when I was 3, she was 6. So I usually went with Lynn, except when I went down to see Jim.
Right. So how would you describe your relationship with your parents at that really young age? Like, do you remember much about them and their jobs or what they were like?
A little bit. I don't remember a whole lot. I remember them. Daddy had his own business. Mother did not. Mother worked, I think, part of the time with him in the business. My grandfather helped my uncle, and he set up their hosiery business, their hosiery mills in the during the Depression. He was he was a farmer, and he was fairly wealthy. He was a Mennonite farmer. He kept his money under his mattress, and he helped them set up their business. So we really never suffered in the Depression at all. We were fine. We lived in Lansdale for a while. We had a babysitter who we called Mama. Mama Ginther was Mama Ginther. And she lived right next door to my Uncle Sam, who was the oldest one in my mother's family. And they lived on 6th Street in Lansdale. And he was a conductor on the railroad. We thought he was pretty cool. He had a neat uniform. And we'd wait for him at the bottom of the street when he'd be coming home. We'd see him coming down the tracks, walking away. But Mama was our babysitter for a long, long time. In fact, later on when we lived in Percy, we'd go down by trolley to her house, Lynn and I, to visit.
Where were you living when you were a teenager? What were some of your teenage memories?
We lived in Percy. We moved to Percy when I was 5, and we lived there forever. From then on, we lived in Percy. And when I was a teenager, we lived in, when I was 10, we moved into what we called the big house. It was a big white house. And we just called it the big house. And it was a pretty big property. It went from 3rd Street to 5th Street. And it was just sort of in the middle. Our address was 4th and Calla Hill, which was the street behind us. And we were sort of in a 4th Street would have gone right through our house. Mm-hmm. But it did not. It stopped the driveway. We built a driveway, and teenage years were pretty good. I never had trouble as a teenager. I had lots of friends, and my dad was always there to take us places.
Was he the chaperone for your friends?
No, he was the driver.
Yeah.
He wasn't the chaperone.
Would he drive you and your friends around?
Oh, yes. To football games, baseball games, any place we wanted to go.
Right. How do you think, back then, how do you think your friends would have described you personality-wise?
I was kind of quiet, but I had a lot of friends. I ran with two groups of girls. You know, one group was the sports ones and the class officers. You know, the ones who ran the school generally. The other group was a group of girls that were just coming along. You know, were making their way through high school, and so I ran through both groups, and I think that was good because if somebody got angry with me, I'd just go with the other group.
Right. Do you, what other hobbies, I guess, did you get into around that age? Were you into sports or writing or anything else?
I played field hockey, which I liked. That's the only sport I ever played was field hockey. I was basketball coach, basketball manager.
Mm.
Three of my best friends were on that team, on the basketball team, and they wanted me to be there too, so I was manager.
Yeah. When World War II was starting, do you remember what that feeling was like? What the people around you were thinking and acting like your parents or your friends? You know, what was the sort of environment like when that was starting?
I was only 6.
Mm.
And I remember thinking at one time, this war will never end. But we did. I had a lot of cousins who were in the service, and that was scared you too, you know, a little bit, because I had 4 of my cousins who were in the Navy. I remember my Aunt Eva had 4 stars in her window. The stars meant how many people she had serving, and she had 2 boys and 2 girls in the service at that time, and I remember being worried, very worried about them. And there were lots of things going on. You know, we had ration books and so forth. So, but I just remember it being a very, very scary time. But I was pretty young. My sister Lynn was a little older, and she was more involved with it. I guess her friends. She had friends who were involved in it too. But I didn't. I just remember worrying about my cousins. And
do you remember what was your relationship like with your parents going through your teen years? Were you guys close? Was it kind of like did you talk about a lot of things in your personal life, or was it just kind of like a more traditional relationship?
I think it was more of a traditional relationship. At that time, you know, parents didn't try to talk and be friends with their kids.
Right.
They took care of them and did what they had to do. But it wasn't like today, you know, where you're really... A lot of the parents are trying real hard to be friends. And that they were not concerned about that. They were just concerned about our safety and what we had to do, you know.
Right.
But we had a lot of freedom at that time. The kids today don't have much freedom at all.
Mm.
My kids had some freedom, but not as much as Lynn and I had, as we had. It was interesting.
Yeah.
It's interesting thinking about it, you know, how things are different. It was still scary, you know. I remember one time when we first moved to Percy, we lived right across the street from Menlo Park, which was a big park. There were rides and there was a whip and cars and things like that. You drive it as a merry-go-round, and there was a big swimming pool. And I remember one Sunday, Lynn and I went over to the park, It was just across the street from us. And we were having fun over there. And then we came home. We were coming home. It was just across the street. And a car stopped and tried to pick us up. A man inside was talking to us. And I was standing there looking at him. Lynn grabbed my hand and we ran. And she ran. She pulled me right across the street. She just pulled me and we ran. She was 8. I was 5. I remember that quite clearly. That was scary, but there weren't many incidents like that. I don't remember ever anything else like that happening, but I do remember that,
Yeah. Yeah, has it been weird for you, I guess, since the time that you were a kid and growing up and having your own kids to kind of have watched culture change in those ways, with more strict barriers, more, I guess, perhaps maybe the biggest factor in that is the reporting on it. There's a lot more through radio and cable television, a lot more reporting of the kind of going-ons that are out there.
And that's what scares parents most, I think, that they hear about it. If you don't hear about it, you don't know about it. But we had radio. We listened to radio a lot. Well, and I think we had a TV too when one of the first TVs that came out when I was in high school sometime, but I don't remember just when. But there was not much reporting on it. It was mostly just fun stuff. We watched silly shows and things like that. But we listened to the radio more than the television.
Do you remember, like, in those kind of preteen or teenage years, what you wanted to be when you grew up? Like, did you have any aspirations or dreams, things that you were hoping to be?
I always wanted to be a teacher. There was never any other thought in my mind.
Where did that come from, you think?
I don't have any idea.
Did you have teachers in your family at all?
No. Women weren't educated. My mother graduated from high school, but my dad did not, and it wasn't common for them at that time to go to school. She did though. She went to secretarial school, I believe, after high school. But there were no teachers in the family that I knew of. In fact, there was no one else who was as educated as my mother.
Did you have any like figures back then who did inspire you specifically, or like heroes that you looked up to, I suppose, in the media or people that you know?
Not really, no. I don't think we knew many people. We didn't. We weren't very well traveled. We didn't go anywhere. We used to take rides on Sunday. Daddy would always take us for a ride on Sunday. We'd drive all over the place.
Yeah.
But we did not. We were very, very close to our family, to my mother's family. And aside from that, we did not do much. We didn't travel. We didn't go anywhere. I remember taking a trip with my Aunt Mabel one time, my cousin Edith, and we drove out through western Pennsylvania for some reason. But that's the only traveling that I ever did. I just didn't know enough people to really aspire to be like them.
It's interesting because I know some of my earliest memories of like you and Papa is you guys did a lot of like world traveling. Do you think that was like, when did that sort of, I guess, passion or aspiration take off? Was it kind of in response to not getting out to see the world when you were younger, or is this just something you kind of developed?
When I was in college, I was very interested in art and architecture. I had taken art lessons when I was in high school, and I had a course in general art, I think it was. I don't know what it was, but I really wanted to see certain things. I wanted to see the Cathedral of Chartres, which is in France, not too far from Paris. And I wanted to see the David, and I wanted to go to the Louvre. So we did. After I graduated from college, I guess it was my first year I had to take classes. I had to take courses to make my certificate permanent. But then the second year after college, that was 1958. First a college friend of mine and I planned to go to Europe, and we had all the planning done, and she got sick and couldn't go. So I was bound and determined to go alone. I said, I'm going anyway. Arrangements are made and I'm going. So my mother was sort of worried, and she talked to my cousin, Joanne, who was just a year younger than I was, and I convinced her that she should go with me, so she did. But that was a really neat trip that we drove all through Europe. We were there for the whole summer. We went from the middle of June until the middle of August, and we hit almost every country. We flew to England, and that was before there were jets, so it was a long trip and a big plane. But anyway, we flew to England, and we flew over to France, and that was a small plane, and it was so bumpy going over there.
It sounds terrifying.
That was terrifying. But we got to Paris, and we were supposed to pick up our car, and we went, and it wasn't ready. Well, the French are just so laid back about things, and anyway, we were there 3 days, I think, before we finally talked to one of the gentlemen who worked there. He was an American, and he said, well, who knows when it'll be ready. He said, but I'm going up to Bremerhaven, which is on the North Sea, north of Germany. And he said, you can go, I'm delivering cars. So he said, you can go with me, and you can see part of the country before you get your own car. So we did. We went with him. And we went first to Stuttgart, picked up 2 cars, and then we drove up the Rhine, up to Bremerhaven, and it was just such a nifty trip.
Very spontaneous.
Very spontaneous. Then we came back to Paris and got our car, and then we left. We had a heck of a time getting out of Paris because you couldn't. The road around the Arc de Triomphe is about 5 lanes. And we couldn't get out of the lane, and all we did was laugh. We were kids, You're driving around, and you can't get out.
Yeah, you can't, shift over 5 lanes.
No, we just couldn't shift out. We had a terrible time shifting out. The first thing we went to see was Chartres, of course, the Cathedral of Chartres. And then we went down to Lyon. And from there down to the Riviera, across the French Riviera to the Italian Riviera. We stopped at Pisa, saw the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and then we went down to Florence. And in Florence, we really saw some nifty things. That was really quite a highlight of our trip. And then we went down to Rome. We were in Rome for about a week, and then we went up to Venice. We had to go by train from the mainland into Venice, and then we went up through northern Italy, which is so pretty. It's pretty mountainous, but it's really beautiful, that country. And then in Switzerland, and that's where we had a terrifying trip.
Oh, what happened?
The roads were of course windy. You're in the mountains, in the mountains there, and the buses had the inside lane. So if you were in the inside lane, driving, you had to get out of their way. They'd blow their horn, and you'd have to get out of the way. Mm-hmm. And it was so absolutely terrifying because they were driving really fast. And you'd have to scoot and go over in the other lane.
Alongside the cliff, you mean?
Yeah, no guardrails. Scared me, really. I had nightmares for years about that driving. Then we went up through Switzerland. We stopped to visit some people that I knew in Bern. I knew their children. I had the children in school, kindergarten, and their grandparents lived in Bern. So we stopped to visit them, and then went on through Germany, and Belgium, and the World's Fair was in Belgium. We stopped in Belgium to see the World's Fair.
Wow.
Walked through there. And then we went back over to Paris. But we really had a good time, and it was quite an interesting trip. And Bud did not want to travel. He was not interested in flying. He was scared to death of flying anymore. He had been in the World War II, and he was in a plane. He was an engineer on a plane. He never talked about that, but he was really scared of flying anymore. He did not feel safe flying, and he was not going to go anywhere. But for the first trip I planned, I said, we'll go to England and we'll go to your old base. And he was very pleased about that. He thought that was fun. So I said, then you don't have to do anything else. I can drop you off at a bar, and I'll go and do the sightseeing, and you can stay at a bar, and I'll pick you up at the end of the day.
Everybody wins.
But he didn't. Once he got there, I think we went up to King's Lynn, which is right near his base, where his base was, and we saw a church that was not a cathedral, just an old church, and it had been built in 10 something.
Oh.
And he was so fascinated with that he wanted to travel after that. He went with me. I didn't have to drop him off at a bar.
There you go. That's great.
He traveled, and we had a great time.
Just to rewind a minute too,
Mm-hmm.
I guess so this is after going back to your European trip with your cousin.
Mm-hmm.
When did you meet Bud? Was this in your late teens, early 20s, or?
Well, I knew Bud from the time I was 14, but I didn't know him very well. The first time I met him, we were taking vocal lessons, Lynn and I, with the Clarks. She took lessons from Frank, and I took lessons from his wife, and I can't remember her name. That way we could take lessons at the same time. And Bud had the lesson with Frank right after Lynn, so that he would always, he kind of thought she was cute. She was 17, and she was very pretty. And I was 14. I was just a kid, you know. So anyway, I knew him then, and then later on I sang in the a cappella choir, and he was in there too. He was in the choir also, but I didn't. He was very exciting. He was probably the most vocal one in the group. You know, he was always making jokes and doing things. So anyway, I didn't know him very well. But then when I was teaching in Paoli, he came. He was coming. He was interviewing for a job, and the other music teacher brought him around to the different schools, you know, to show him where we were. And they came to Paoli School where I was teaching for lunch. And when they came in, I was sitting there, and I said, "Oh, I know him." I said, "I know you. You're Bud Allebach." And he said, "Yeah, I am." He said, "You're Nancy Leatherman." So he knew who I was. And I guess it was during that year or the next year he and the teacher in the next room were standing in the hallway. You know, they were changing classes, and they were teaching in junior high. And Al, his name was Al, and I knew Al very well. He was married, and I'd met his family. You know, we'd been out there. I had been out to their home, and he said to Bud, he said, "Why don't you date Nan Leatherman?" And Bud said, "Well, she's just a kid." And he said, "No, she's 25." So he did ask me out, and then that was in December of 1959, and then he asked me to marry him on New Year's Eve. That was funny. That was very quick.
What was he doing at the time? This was after the war. I mean, was he working? Was he in school, or?
After the war, he worked in a pants factory in Souderton, and he was supervisor of some kind or other, but he knew how to sew. He sewed, did a lot of machine work and so forth. He knew how to fix sewing machines and so forth. And then his brother Ken convinced him that he should go to college. By the time he decided to go, his GI Bill had run out, naturally, so he had to borrow money to go. But he went to college, and when he was in his late 20s, and then so he was teaching. When I met him again, he was 35, and I was 25. So, but he'd been teaching up at another school before he came down to Paoli.
You taught music, right?
He was a music teacher. He taught vocal music, of course. I think he was in elementary school before he came to us, and he was teaching everything there. He was teaching instrumental music as well as vocal.
Did you two connect on that pretty early on? Because I know, like, from growing up, you were both taking vocal lessons, and I know when I was growing up, coming to both your house, you always had classical music playing, or jazz, or
almost always classical.
Yep.
And we were both musical. He was a music teacher, and I sang a lot. I sang in his. By the time we got married, I sang in his church choir. Until our boys grew up, I was singing in the church choir quite a long time. We did a lot of music. I mean, that was his profession. He loved music, and so did I.
I know, like, in local communities, especially back then, churches were a great way to connect musically, because they always had a really tight-knit environment for that. Were you guys kind of plugged in for those reasons, or did you kind of have like a church community that you sung with or did music with? Or
After we were married, yes, he was in the choir. He was directing the choir, and I sang in the choir. And we did that for years. Even when he was teaching, he was directing in Telford, United Church of Christ, when we first were married. And then he went down to Paoli, and we moved down. We were living in Paoli, and he was traveling back and forth to Telford on Wednesdays for rehearsal and Sundays for church. And then he had two other choirs or so in the Paoli area. He finally left Trinity for a while, and I sang in those choirs too. I followed him along and sang in his church choir. Then he went back to Trinity again.
Just to kind of go back to something you were talking about earlier, you had mentioned he never liked talking about the war. Does that include with you? Like, when you guys first got married, did you ever have any conversations about it? Or
we never had any. He never talked about the war at all until we moved up here. We were living on Cowpath Road, and one of the crew members, it was Hank, I think. He went online and he got in touch with everybody, all the crew members, you know. I think there was only one he couldn't reach, and that was one of Bud's best friends in that time. And they all got together. I think they came to our house first. They were all there, and he said he wasn't talking to me much about it, but then he went with them to a reunion. I don't remember what, but we went to many of them after that. I did not go with him out to Ohio. He flew out there, and he was terrified of flying. He did not want to go. And I said, "You'll be fine." Off he went.
Do you think that originate from flying in the war, or was it before?
Oh yes, no, it was, he just didn't want to fly.
Yeah.
Because he trusted his pilot. And he didn't want to fly with anyone else. He just felt, well, of course, they weren't flying jets at that time. You know, they were flying B-24. He was in a B-24, which was a big, bulky plane. And he was a kid when he was he was just young, you know, in his early 20s. But he had some terrifying experiences, you know, and he did not want to talk about it. We talked more about it after he got connected with his crew again, and we started visiting back and forth, and then we'd talk. He'd talk about things a little bit. He never did get into a whole lot about the war. He told me about one time he was in the top turret of the plane. That was his position. And he said there was so much flak. They were over Germany, and there was so much flak that he was so frightened he just turned his chair around and didn't look. And another time he said he had to open the bomb door. The bomb bay door did not open. It evidently opened automatically when the pilot did it, and it didn't open. It was stuck. So he and another one of the crew members had to go down and stand above the open door. They had to open the door by hand, and he said he was really scared to death.
That's terrifying.
But he didn't talk too much. He talked more about the fun things in the war, than the terrifying things. But he said one time they didn't get back. They had, I know why. That's when they had, the one crew member had wanted to sit up in the nose because they were very low, and he wanted to see what was going on. And he was shot in the leg from ground fire, They were down so low. And so they had to stop and drop him off in Belgium to a hospital, so he could get treated. And then they were late getting back, and everybody thought they were shot down, and they stole all their clothing and things. So he said they got back, there was nothing in their barracks. They were just totally wiped out. He said that's the way they worked. He said if a plane was shot down, people they just took their stuff,
Assumed dead. Yeah.
Assumed dead, right. But they weren't. They got back, and he said whenever they got back, they got a shot of whiskey. And Hank was the youngest one of the crew, and he did not drink at all. So he always gave his shot to Bud. And he talks about riding his bicycle from the base out to a pub. They would wobble along on their bicycles.
I'm sure it was cathartic for him to meet up with his old friends after the war and be able to have those difficult conversations and process it a little bit.
Yes, but none of them. They just didn't talk about it at the time. I guess it was too hard to talk about. They saw some terrible things, and he was always thankful that he was in a plane rather than on the ground.
You, growing up, though, like through those years in your marriage with Bud, how would you describe his personality? Because I know obviously he went through the war and it was a terrible, terrifying experience, but I've always thought of, looking back at old photos and videos, him being like a pretty upbeat, happy kind of guy. Or like, what was he like with you?
He was both. When I met him, he was seeing a psychologist, and he was on uppers and downers. That's what they did with him at that time, which I didn't approve of at all, but he'd either be on top of the world or he'd be very depressed. Mm. And he was always a depressant, but that's not the image he gave to other people. He was always very, very friendly and happy, and, very outgoing. But he had both sides to that personality.
Was it difficult for you to deal with that kind of ups and downs, or you just managed it?
No, it didn't bother me much. I just
you just went with the flow.
I just went with the flow, right? He never was really, really. He was depressed a lot. I mean, I had gotten him a light, one of those lights for depressed people. You don't look at the light, but you sit under it for a while. It helps your mood. He would be depressed starting usually when daylight savings stopped, and the light changed. Then he'd be depressed most of the winter. And then he'd be back again in the spring when the light came back. That's why I got him a light. but he didn't use it much. I had forced him to use it.
He's stubborn.
He was very stubborn. But he was a good man. He was really fun.
Did while you guys were married and living in this area, where were your younger siblings? Like, and where was Lynn? Like, were all of you still local, or were you kind of scattered around the country, or?
Well, Lynn was in Jersey. She and Lance and their kids lived in Cinnamons, and when we were first married, Lynn and Lance lived in South Percy. They had a house in South Percy. Then they moved to Cinnamons. And Jerry went to the Naval Academy. He was during the Vietnam War. He was in the Navy, and I remember being very worried about him. But he was really not in the fighting. He was out on a ship somewhere or other. He wasn't really close to fighting, but you don't know your geography that well, you know. I was worried he was too close. Linda was, well, let me see. When she graduated from high school, she went to, she got a scholarship, a full run scholarship to go to a college, a music college. It was in music because she was really a terrific pianist, and Linda was always felt like an outsider to herself, and she went to college. Mom and Dad took her out. I think it was Oberlin or some such thing, and she stayed maybe half a semester. And then she left, and she didn't tell my parents. She went to Philadelphia, got a job, and was living there. And that whole scholarship just went to pot, you know. I mean, she had everything. She had her housing, food, and books. Everything was paid for. It was a complete full scholarship, you know. And she just left. She was really bright, but she left then and went up to Canada with another friend, and they joined communes and went across Canada and then down into California. So she wasn't home. I mean, she wasn't around. Scott was still pretty young.
Just I guess for context, how far apart is Linda and Scott from you in age?
Linda is 10 years younger than I. Scott is 17.
Right.
17 years younger. He was born when I was in high school,
right.
Senior in high school.
So when you were in your young adult years, you probably didn't have that close of a relationship with either of them, because they would have been
either one of
really
them,
young. Yeah.
No, I did not. Scott was just like about 5, I think. 4 or 5 while I was in college, you know. And he was about the age of the kids I was teaching. So Lynn and Jerry and I were close, but the others were too far apart, you know, and circumstances took us away, you know, and I was married by the time Linda left.
Around what age into adulthood did you all kind of like rekindle? Like when Scott and Linda were a little older?
Around the time my parents' 50th anniversary. By that time we were all reconnected. Scott was a traveler too. He was a tennis pro, and he was with Newman. First he was in Texas, then he went from Texas to Fiji, and from Fiji he went to Germany. So he was not home much, you know. We didn't see him much until after his travels were over, you know, and he came and got a job in New York. So that was probably around my parents' 50th anniversary, because we were all there for that. So we'd been connected. Linda was back in New York by that time. She had left California, and she was with Charles. And
so you were all in like the tri-state area, relatively.
Mm-hmm. Lynn was in Jersey. Lynn's the only one that we really saw, because when I had four little boys, you know, close together.
Yeah, you can't really travel.
And you didn't do too much. And Lynn helped me out when Jamie and John were both in the hospital at the same time. I guess Jamie had gotten a virus and brought it home, and John got it. And John was nearly dead when we took him to the hospital. And they were in the hospital for, I think 10 days.
Wow.
And I was pregnant with Ward. And the doctor was worried about me. And so we took David over to Lynn. Lynn took care of David that week. So we were free to go to the hospital, and see the kids. And I didn't have any carrying of kids to do. The doctor was really worried about my pregnancy at that time, but we got through it.
I feel like your kids were always having health issues or something growing up.
But Jamie was the worst when your dad was the worst.
Yeah.
He was sick all the time. He had so many problems. He was born with the allergies. He had eczema, and then he got asthma. Developed into asthma. And by the time he was 2, we knew there was something else wrong with him, and that was his blood disorder. He had to have a shot of gamma globulin, I think, every month. And that went on for years, because he was almost like a bubble baby at that time. He had almost no immunity, and his white cells were practically non-existent. So that's why he got the gamma globulin, each month to support the white cells. And he got sick a lot. He had no immunity. So anything that came down the road, he got.
Right. And he had his issue with his leg.
That was when he was in first grade. His teacher said, "He's limping. I don't know why." And I said, I see him limping. I said, but he was so neurotic at that time. I said, I think it's probably just put on. And then one night I took him to the bathroom, got up at night, and he was still asleep, and he's limping in his sleep. So I knew that it wasn't his neuroticness. So I took him to the doctor the next day and told him what was wrong. And he figured he was a great diagnostician, because from just what I told him, which wasn't much, that he was limping and didn't seem to be in pain, but he was limping. And he diagnosed it as leg perthes. His hip was disintegrating. The hip bone was disintegrating, and he had to wear a brace. He wore a brace, and that went on for 4 or 5 years, I think. He wasn't allowed to. The right foot was not allowed to touch the ground. So he had a brace that had a spring in it, and his foot did not touch the ground, and there was no knee brace. It was just a straight brace, so his knee was straight. He couldn't get on his knees, because that would put weight on his hip. And then his other shoe had a big build-up sole to make him balance from the spring, And he dealt with that for a while, for 4 or 5 years. Jamie was a fighter. He had to be. I used to say to Bud, thank God it was Jamie who had this problem and not David, because David would not have fought. David would have probably just laid down and let it ride. But Jamie fought. Jamie was always a fighter.
What was it like mothering 4 rambunctious boys growing up?
It was quite busy. Quite busy, and then Jamie needed so much special attention that I think some of the other boys felt neglected. They weren't, but they felt neglected. They felt that we gave Jamie so much attention because he needed it. He just had so many special things happening to him all the time. But it was quite a busy time.
How did Bud handle it? Like, what was I don't know, were there any specific stories or memories you have from growing up with the boys? Anything that stands out in your mind?
Well, Bud, first of all, when I was 26 when David was born, and I was not prepared for motherhood at all. I had been not prepared for motherhood, and I was scared to death of this child. And I'd be home with him during the day, and I'd be sitting. I remember when he'd come home from school almost every day. We'd be sitting in the rocking chair. I'd be crying. He'd be crying. And Bud would take him right away, and he took care of him so much so that David did not want me anymore. He wanted Dad all the time. And Dad wasn't getting his sleep that he needed to be going to work. And when I got pregnant with Jamie, he said, "This was yours." Because David was always stuck with Dad, was always with Dad. But I remember I had to shield Bud a lot from a lot of things. I just didn't tell him because Jamie was diagnosed 3 times with they thought he had cancer, 3 different times for 3 different things, and finally the last time Jamie was probably about 5, and he was diagnosed with I had to take him to a proctologist, and we were at summer camp. Bud ran a summer camp, and the doctor there thought he had cancer. And I called my doctor, and he said, "It's August." He said, "Don't tell Bud. Just wait it out." He said, "I'll make an appointment for you with a good doctor, and we'll see what happens." And of course, none of the times did he have cancer, but he was diagnosed with it, and it was scary. You know? And he said, "Just don't tell Bud."
So you got to be home now with the kids, having to think about that and worry about that, and you can't even tell your husband. You don't want to freak him out.
He probably insisted on going home right away, and the doctor knew him very well, and he just said, "Don't tell him." He'd often say, "Just don't tell Bud anything."
Do you have any specific memory that stand out? I guess like trips with the kids growing up, or like anything you all did together that you loved doing, or anything like that?
We didn't do any traveling with the kids at all, except we went to Massachusetts every summer. You know, for from the time David was a baby, we went every year until close to the 70s. It must have been 70, 71. And Bud ran summer camp. It was an 8-week camp, you know, for wealthy kids, very wealthy kids. It was a Jewish camp, and they were mainly kids from New York City. And he loved it. He loved it. He was head counselor there, and for all those years we went, and our kids all went, and the little ones, David, Jamie, Jamie, John, and Ward, were not ever old enough to be a camper. David was. David was a camper most of the time, and David was not real thrilled with being a camper. He slept in the bunk. He didn't sleep at home, you know, and he was not as independent as Jamie was. Jamie would have loved it. But he was not quite old enough, you know. He was 2.5 years younger than David. But he had lots of fun. They really had a good time up there because they loved nature, you know. He and John were forever in the frog ponds, you know. They were forever finding frogs and sticking them in their pockets. But that was a good thing. They say they had their summer up in Massachusetts where it was lovely, and they had they could use any of the activities there. They were allowed to do almost anything. The owner, Pete, loved the kids, and he used to take them for rides on his motorcycle, which they loved, but I didn't.
I'm sure that scared you.
It did. I remember pet birds up there. They had, the nature cabin always had pet birds. You know, they had raised little birds they had found and raised. And one was a robin, and 1 year. And Jamie loved that robin. Robin used to sit on his shoulder, and he loved that robin. And then another year they had a crow, and he was aggressive. And he would fly down at the boys. The boys would hear him coming, and they'd put their hands on their heads and they'd dive to the ground, because the crow would peck them on the back of their head,
right.
Peck them on their heads. So, but they liked that. It was quite an experience, They all did interesting things. They did a lot of water activities. They were in the water a lot. We were on a lake, and it was really, really quite nice.
Did you always garden growing up? Because I feel like, they were always, your whole family I always pictured as very outdoorsy, and obviously with all this, and growing up as your grandkid, I felt like you guys were always gardening and making your own food and all that. Well,
Bud and I did. We didn't garden until we came up to Souderton, because we didn't have the facility for it in Paoli. We had a nice property, but it was all shaded. It was old trees, and it was really, there wasn't any room for a garden, and Bud really wanted a garden. He had a garden he used to make a garden for his mother, at their place, and he really wanted a garden. So when we moved up here, up to Souderton, we bought the house in March, I guess, and had closing in June. So he asked the people who lived there if he could put in a garden, because we would have been late, getting a garden in by the end of June. And they said, sure, fine and dandy. So he rented a rototiller, and he made a garden there. And it was he was delighted. The soil was great, and ever since then. We had a lot of gardens. We had gardens all over the place there.
Yeah, I remember even you guys rototilling that space growing up, and you said it was over top of an old 1900s dump, right? There was a bunch of glass and ceramics that was in the dirt there.
The people who lived in those houses. That house was very old. That was about 300 years old. The people who lived there didn't have garbage pickup, of course, so they just dumped their garbage out back, and their broken crockery and so forth. So we found lots of things, you and I, and we'd go out in the garden when it was rototilled up. You'd find that they'd come up to the top, And we found oyster shells. I found a part of a pipe one time. But it was really interesting, the things we'd find.
Yeah, it was like treasure hunting for me as a kid. Those are great memories. All the different really cool designed pottery and glasses.
And glass and things we'd find, yeah. I liked it too.
Yeah, your house was always filled with trinkets and treasures and collectibles. Was most of that, even all this stuff in this room right now, did you get most of this from traveling, or?
Some of the Hummels over there. I got the one in Germany. The little doctor I got in Germany, and then the others I just bought as I saw them, because I liked the Hummels. They were so cute. Now some of the other pottery, the one below it, that plate there, that came from Portugal. We bought some things in our travels, and some things we just found, the boys used to go down to the dump behind Lidie's house across the street from us, and they would, in fact, I think your dad was probably the biggest scavenger. Found all kinds of bottles and things. Most of the bottles I have on medicine bottle type things are on the out here and on the desk now. But we found a lot of things, and I bought antiques. I liked antiques. And we were lucky we had Bill Kratz right across the street, and he owned a crate. He had an antique store, and he would look for things for me. If I'd tell him I was looking for something, he would find it.
Your connection.
It was really, really nice.
Yeah, I always felt like when I was walking into the old farmhouse that it was like a time machine almost. You know,
Yeah.
everything from the floors and the architecture to the
To
design,
the cave in the cellar.
the cave. Yep.
And it had a fireplace down in the basement. That was the summer kitchen.
They used to hang like livestock down there, right? And there's like before they had refrigerators.
Mm-hmm.
They would do.
Well, the cave was over the well. That's why it was always cool there, and they'd keep things in there. There were stone shelves, if you recall,
Mm-hmm.
and I think they kept produce in there. And it would have been a good place to keep squash and things like that for the winter, and potatoes and things like that, because it was cooler, and the whole cellar was cooler. It was a dirt floor at one time, and then someone poured cement over the dirt. You just poured cement over the dirt, so that's why it was such a leaky basement.
Were you and Bud always into seafood? I remember growing up, me and you guys always, whether it was kippers or sardines or oysters or so always something there.
We always loved seafood, both of us. Lobsters, clams. Lobster used to be really cheap, you know. When I was growing up, lobster was the poor man's food. It was really, we had delivery men who would come to the house, you know, and Friday was the fish man. Mother had always ordered lobster for the card party, because they got together, sisters and brothers, you know, and wives, her family. They'd all get together and play pinochle. And lobster was one of their snacks, you know. So I grew up eating a lot of seafood, and so did Dad, so did Bud.
I always joked growing up that my mom's side of the family was a lot more uh, traditional, a lot more kind of like Americana in their style of food. You know, meatloaf, potatoes, that type of food. And then whenever we'd go to Dad's side of the family, it was always, you know, oysters on crackers and things that being like 7, 8 years old, I would never have tasted them otherwise. I think it helped me expand my palate at a young age.
Well, we did that with our kids too. We exposed them to different foods, a lot of foods very young, you know, when they were just kids, and they all enjoyed eating. You know, they all had a good palate, and they enjoyed good food. And I think it's because you introduce it to when they're young, you know, and then they eat. Some families have kids who don't eat, you know.
Yeah.
And we never had that. They always ate. They ate anything.
It's better than the alternative, right?
Uh-huh.
What was it like for you going through the sort of like initial period after Bud had his stroke?
That was hard. Bud had a stroke in '95, and he was not a happy camper. He was very upset. I remember the first winter that he had after he had his stroke. He had his stroke in August. We were planning to take you to Ocean City, and we had the trip ready because Tessa was being born, and we were going to take you. And then he had his stroke, so I took you by myself because he insisted that I go. He was in the hospital, and he was fine. He was stable, but so we had a good time. But Bud was in the hospital almost a month, I think, after that first stroke. That winter, there was a real big snowstorm. And I remember I was out using the snowblower and trying to make my way through the mess. And I came in, and he was in tears. He was so upset that I was having to do that. And I said, for heaven's sakes, Bud, you know, you can't. I will. I told him, she took care of me for 30 years, you know. He did all the cooking, and he did everything he needed to do. I said, now I'll take care of you for 30 years. Didn't last quite that long, but it was hard. It was hard on him. Harder on him, I think, than on me in the beginning, because he had lost all his use of his body. He could still walk, but he felt bad because he had to hold my hand, to walk. He couldn't walk on his own even from the beginning until he got used to a cane. Then he was all right. He was walking on his own, but it was very hard for him. And being a depressant the way he was, I finally had to say to him one day, I said, bud, make up your mind. You're either going to live or you're going to die. If you want to sit here and just mope yourself into death, go ahead and do it. But if not, then you've got to get up and get moving and do things. And that shook him up, I guess, enough to make him go. I really pushed him a lot, I think, in doing things. But it was good for him. He would have just sat there and disintegrated, if I wouldn't have pushed him and made him do things. But we traveled. We had been planning a trip to Portugal that September that he had his stroke, and of course we had to cancel that. So we went the next year, and he didn't think that he could do that. And I said, yes, you can. And we did, He took him to Portugal. I'd take him over town. I'd take him over into the town. I'd walk with him over town and deposit him in the park. And he'd sit there and talk to people. He made friends and just talk to people while I did shopping or sightseeing or some such thing, But he enjoyed that trip. And our friends came to me to spend a week with us, John, Callie, and Margaret. That was nice, too,
Do you think he enjoyed or got some kind of, positive benefit out of being able to have those kind of conversations with people during that time?
Oh, yes, I think so. It was good with him. Good for him to be out and talking to people, After we stopped traveling to Europe, we went to Europe, I think, 4 or 5 times after his stroke. Then in 2000, when I closed the business, then he thought we couldn't afford it anymore, and I said yes we could. But he didn't believe it. He didn't want to go after that. He said I said, well, we'll just stay here where I can drive, and I had a car, the van that would take his scooter or his wheelchair, whatever he was in. And that's when we started going to Florida in the winter. And that was so good for him because he really looked forward to that, just being back in the sunshine, again.
Especially with those, sounds like the seasonal depression that he had in the wintertime.
That he did. He did have seasonal depression. And he couldn't drive. Well, he did drive for a while after his stroke, but then they didn't take they should have taken his license away right after he had his first stroke, but they did not for some reason. He had several interesting experiences. One was he came home one day and he, instead of hitting the brake, he hit the gas. And he went up over the ramp in the garden shed. He was in the old Cadillac, and Joe and Stephen had to get the car down and get him out of there. But that was scary. And then he wouldn't listen. He'd go. I'd say, "Bud, you should not drive anywhere except you go to the store, locally, but you shouldn't go anywhere." And he was going all over the place. He would go down to Montgomeryville, and that made me terribly nervous. And after his second stroke, he had a second stroke, and was in the hospital for a little bit, and then they took his driver's license away. So he was taking a driver's course with for his condition over in Doylestown. And the man who was working with him over there, he knew his personality. He just got to know him very well, and he really, really knew what Bud didn't know, that he really should not be driving. And when it came to take the test, his final test, he took him down to Roosevelt Boulevard. And of course Bud panicked and he did not pass the test. And I think he did that. I know he did that on purpose because he didn't want him to pass, but he didn't want to just say you can't drive anymore, because that wouldn't have gone over with him very well.
You need to show him that this is a dangerous thing that you're playing with.
Yeah. So after that, he couldn't drive, and that was scary for him too. I'd drive, and he was constantly telling me what to do, what not to do, and finally I said, "If you don't stop it, I'm going to stop the car and push you out, and you can walk." But he did that. Everything had to be done his way. Ward remembers when, after his stroke, he came home to help Bud can tomatoes. And he said, Dad said, everything had to be done just a specific way. And when you put it in the pot, you do this first, then that, and then it piles up and so forth. And he said he was so fanatical about everything having to be done his way. And I said, yes, that's your father. Because I took over the garden, and the first year I was planting and he was watching. He was supervising, and I was planting seed. And he said, your rows aren't straight. And I said, who cares? He said, your rows have to be straight. You use a string and you make your rows straight.
I remember the string.
Yeah, we always used the strings. I did after that. But he just always had to have things done his way, and he'd supervise. And when I had to learn to cook, because he'd cooked all the time. So I'd be cooking. I'd learn to cook. I had cookbooks, and I wasn't too bad a cook in the beginning. But he'd sit there and tell me what I had to do, and I'd find same thing. He has to say, just stop it, or I'm not going to do this anymore.
Right. I'm sure it was had to at least somewhat be just a control thing, because he realized he didn't have control over his life anymore.
Right.
So he had to feel like there was something he could, lead, something that he could manage on his own.
His cousin used to come and rototille the garden for him, and all he did was complain. Because he didn't do it the way he did, and he dragged dirt out of the garden instead and didn't put it back. He said, you bring it out and then you take it back, and he didn't do that. And so Bud just constantly complained.
Was that attitude, I guess, did it change after the stroke? Like, was he like that much of a kind of control person beforehand, or did it kind of come out more?
It came out more afterwards. Yeah. I don't think he was not a controlling person before that, but afterwards he really was. He really tried to, everything had to be done his way.
Yeah.
In the beginning. It didn't last, because none of us listened to him. I can't tell you how many times I came home from daycare, from work, and found him on the ground somewhere. He wouldn't listen, and he'd go out on his own, and he'd fall, and then he couldn't get up, so he'd just lay there. Wait, sometimes he was out in the driveway for 3 hours before it was time for me to come home. He wouldn't take his phone with him anywhere. I got him a cell phone, and I made him a little harness pocket thing that would hook on his pants, and to keep his phone in, but he wouldn't bother with it. He just didn't bother. And one time he went out the front door, and I told him from the very beginning, I said, don't you ever go out the front door, because there's nothing to hold on to, and you're going to fall. And then there are 3 steps at the bottom. And he did. He went out to get the mail. He thought he was going to walk out to get the mail. Well, naturally he fell. He fell almost into the street. And two cars stopped. They came up. One was a nurse, and the other was a worker like Adrian is, worked with the elderly, and
What are the chances of that?
Yeah, they picked him up and took him in the house. But otherwise, he'd have been laying out there in the street for God knows how long, you know. He just simply didn't listen. And another time, he had driven over to see Peg, and he was coming back, and he came back with dirt road, Township Line Road. I don't know if you know that road. And it was a dirt road then. And he got to the bottom of a hill, and I guess the car had a problem and stopped, and he had not taken his phone, of course. So there he sat in the car, you know, in this road that was not very well traveled, a dirt road, and he sat there for an hour or so, and then a farmer came along and pulled him out. I guess he got stuck in, it must have been rainy and it was muddy or something, that the car got stuck. Because the farmer pulled him out, you know, had a tractor, and he pulled him out, and then he came on home. And I said, you know, if you'd had your phone with you, you could have just called me, and I could have, otherwise, how would anyone have known where you were if that farmer hadn't come along? You could have been there for days. But he just did things like that all the time, that because he couldn't accept the fact that he couldn't do it, you know.
What did the two of you talk about on a regular basis? I mean, I know whenever I came over, you'd be listening to classical music. Sometimes you'd be reading books together.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what were kind of like normal conversations like?
All about the kids and grandkids and what we were doing, or if we were planning to go somewhere, you know, about our trips and so forth, or friends coming over, you know, that type of thing. Just normal conversation.
You guys had a lot of friends, a lot of family friends, and your house is pretty central. Like you always had people over. And
we did a lot. Well, Bud's family was quite entertaining, and we used to have parties a lot. You know, we had a lot of people over, and his family was always the noisy ones. I remember Peg coming in. We had an after party after your after your parents' wedding, because they did not have booze. And of course, our Bud's family were quite boozers. You know, they drank a lot. I remember being back at the house, and Peg coming in, and she said, "Somebody, quick, get me a drink." She wanted a drink right away. She was really, really quite vocal. But we did have a lot of fun. We had a lot of friends. He had his friends from school. Jim was his best friend from school, and then John Kelly. I don't know if you ever met John. Did you ever meet John?
I don't believe so.
Our boys used to go down to, they had a place at the shore, John and Jean. Jean was quite a piece of work. She was forever correcting food. Bud would take things down, he'd say, "Don't let Jean touch it." Because Jean would put things in to extend it, you know. She had 6 kids, I guess, and John was the teacher, and she did not work. She didn't work. So they were scraping bottom, you know, pretty much. And she was always having to extend her food, so she was always adding things to it, and then Bud would get furious. "Don't let Jean touch this." But our boys went down there to visit. They'd go down there a lot. They had, I think Jean inherited the house in Ventnor. And it had it was a double house, and one side they lived in and one side they rented. I think they rented part of the other house too, maybe the 3rd floor or something like that. But our boys went down there a lot, and they'd tell you stories about Jean and John.
Pretty much for as long as I can remember, going to your place for like family gatherings or whatever it might be. Various parts of the family have always been pretty political, or pretty into, like, I guess maybe I should say intellectual. I'm interested in history and having lively debates and conversations about things. Where did that, you think, come from? Was that like something that was in a certain part of the family, or?
Well, Bud's family was very political. We were all pretty much left wing, you know. And during the Vietnam War, it was quite controversy, you know, quite controversial. And we talked a lot. We had a lot of lively debates.
Was that like you think like a lot of people that you knew in your family or friends, like a kind of political awakening moment with the Vietnam War?
I think so. Well, I not with Bud's family. No, Sis and Lou were political always. Sis worked in Washington during the Second World War. She was a WAC, I guess, and she worked in Washington. And I guess that's where her political interest started, you know, when she was there. And the rest of them just simply were political, you know, and noisily so. And we weren't debating, we weren't arguing, because we were all basically left wing, but just talking about things would get them all excited, and especially Lou and Sis.
Right. I mean, I should say I remember growing up, some parts being a little more debate-oriented, particularly around my dad, because he was kind of the black sheep within a lot of the community.
Your dad was the only one who strayed from the left-wing side, and he went very strongly right-wing. Well, I think that was because of his prison experience. The churches came into the prison, you know, and they presented him a lot, and I think he got a lot of his opinions from that.
Mm-hmm.
I was very angry with our minister because he did not go down to visit him at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really ticked off. I thought that's his job. The assistant minister did. She went down to see him often, but Carl never went down. I was not happy with that.
Was there anything, I guess, growing up that you can think of, any specifics or any kind of general beliefs that you've had from way back when to now that have changed dramatically, or anything that you've like grown or shifted on that you can think of, or you've been kind of
well, politics. Let's go back to that. My family was all very Republican, you know, and when I was in college, I shifted. And I was very, very, very Democratic, you know. And I remember arguing with my parents about that. They didn't like it at all, you know. But that's the way it was, you know. I changed a lot. You know, you grow and you study and you learn, and then you develop your ideas. You know what you want to believe and what you work for. And I think the college helped me to become what I am today, you know, as far as politics go. My sister married Lance McCurley, and he was a Democrat, of course, and she stayed Republican, so they just argued and argued about political issues a lot, and they never agreed. But then later on, Lynn changed too. She is now a Democrat, but Linda was always the feisty one. You know, she was always the one who had strong opinions and let them out. You know.
Was she a hippie at that time?
She in the '60s. She was a hippie. Yeah, she was. She was in San Francisco and did a lot of was in with a lot of the stuff going on in the '60s.
Right.
San Francisco was a hotbed. It was a hotbed of hippies. I think that's where she met Charles. She met Charles there in the '60s sometime. But she was quite active, you know, and she and Dad never got along. She always argued with Daddy. I mean, she was so strong. Well, my father was basically a bigot, I think. I used to tell him that too, but and he was really. I remember in college, my rebellion in college was that I only dated Catholic boys and either Irish or Italian because my father was so opposed. And I'd bring them home for to visit and so forth and so on. And I'd always have to warn them. I'd say, "Now be careful of my father because my father and my uncle they will say offensive things, which they did. But it worked out all right, But I think I was rebelling in that way.
It's funny how those patterns never really change. Kids and their parents and differing beliefs and all that when you rebel.
You do, yeah. You have to. You have to if you want to grow. You're growing and changing all the time. And well, my dad had his reasons. I mean, he had a business, and of course, the unions were coming in when he had his business because of Roosevelt, and that was the last thing he wanted. He did not want unions. He was very strong against that because it would have hurt his business.
Right.
It hurt his business to do that. He hated Roosevelt.
A lot of small business owners have that feeling of just like,
Sure.
the kind of building competition between unions raising prices and all
Sure.
that.
Well, they're business officers, they're business owners, and they're looking to preserve their business. So he was very, very strongly opposed to unions, and he stayed a very strong Republican, against everything, always.
Yeah. In terms of religious beliefs, like what were you brought up believing? Was anything specific, or was it kind of like a general Protestantism? Or?
Well, we belonged to the Lutheran Church. My mother and my father were both brought up Mennonite, and they left the church when they got married. Well, my father had left the church before that, and they were really old Mennonites. I don't think they were like the East. East were what they called the Black Mennonites because they drove black cars and they always wore black clothing and so forth. They were very, very separatist. They still are. And I guess Dad's family was pretty much like that. Mother's family was not. They were Mennonite. And I was brought up in the Mennonite church and the Lutheran church because my grandfather always wanted us down at the farm. We'd have to we were required to spend a week at least down at the farm every summer. And we were required to be there every Sunday. That's just the way it was.
Right.
And so we went to church in the Blooming Glen Church. Do you know that church?
Mm-hmm.
It was, at that time, it was the women sat on one side, the men on the other. And we'd sit in the back row with Grammy. She would take us to church. And she always had a little tin of sensense. They were little licorice bits. Did you ever heard of sensense? And she'd feed us sensense if we were being at all disruptive, But we always had to sit in the back row, on the women's side. And I remember aspiring to getting a cap, the white caps. I thought they were so beautiful, and I really aspired to that. But then I was not really brought up completely Mennonite. I was brought up Lutheran.
Right. As you got older, were there any, specific religious beliefs that changed over time, or what did you kind of evolve into as you were married to Bud, when you were going to different churches?
We always believed basically the same thing. Well, the Lutheran church I was brought up in was a pretty high Lutheran. It was almost like a Catholic church, in their teachings and their services and so forth. But then when we got married, we joined the Church of Christ in Telford, and that was an easier church to live by. All our children were baptized, and I don't think my beliefs changed much. Bud was basically an atheist. He just didn't believe. And I'd ask him why. I talked to him about it, and he said, well, he didn't believe in the virgin birth. And I said, well, what's so hard to believe about that? I said, it's just a belief. You believe it or you don't. You should have blind faith in some things. But he just could never really continue. Your father says he swears it. Before he died, he said he believed, but if he did, it was only to please Jamie.
Did you guys talk about that much as you were kind of growing up, or?
Not a whole lot, but we did in the beginning. We talked about religion a little bit in the beginning. I was very horrified that he was an atheist, that he really did not believe, and I just did, but I was brought up on blind faith,
Mm. It's interesting because you still throughout all that he was still pretty involved in the church choir and all.
He was for 35 years. He was in church choir.
Yeah.
And he went to all the services and he did all the things, but he did not really believe. He loved the music, but he was not a believer himself. He really did not. And I used to be upset about that.
And then eventually you guys just it became that you were at peace with it and
Mm-hmm.
just
Well, I just always figured he was a very good man. He really was. He was a fine man, and I don't know. I just think that Jerry was also an atheist. He did not believe either. I don't know why, but he did not. I never had many discussions with him about it, but that's the way he was, and I just made up my mind Jerry was a good person too, and let's hope that they're all right,
Right.
Yeah, because you don't really know. And I was never very religious, but I did have, blind faith in a lot of things, and I was always brought up in the church, and I attended church always until later years. I think it just got to be too much, with Bud. We couldn't go and do things anymore, so I stopped going to church, but that didn't mean I stopped believing,
Looking back through your life, I'm sure there's countless things, but what's something that you're most proud of that you've done or that you've been through throughout your life?
Well, of course, I love teaching. I really liked teaching, and I was very, very pleased with my teaching, and I was also very, very, very pleased with Bud. Dealing with Bud too. They were two very important things in my life. I mean, I took care of him for how many years? 95 till 18, till 13. So it was almost 20 years. It was 18 years. That was an important part of my life, That and my teaching. I love teaching.
Do you have a favorite food or recipe from over the years that stands out?
No, not really. Of course, we like the oyster.
The oyster stuffing?
The oyster stuffing, yes.
That's my favorite.
And we used to make lobster, the whole lobster. So he'd get a 5-pound lobster, We'd stuff it with crab meat. You'd clean out all the cavities and stuff it with crab meat. And that was always a fun thing to do. We liked that.
Did you have, growing up, like a favorite car or anything like that?
Well, I loved the first car that I ever owned was a Volkswagen. And I loved that little car. That was really a nice car. And I loved it. It had a little flower pot. And you'd hang on this thing and they'd keep flowers in it,
That's neat.
It was fun. It was a nice little car. I really liked it. And I bought that new. I mean, I bought that in between 57 and 58, I think I bought that car. And they had to send to Germany for it.
That's cool.
So I had to wait for it to come, but it was brand new and it was a nice little car.
Any favorite books or authors that come to mind? I know. Didn't you love Ken Follett?
Ken Follett, yes.
Yeah.
I liked him a lot. I read a lot of his stuff. And I was a mystery reader. You know, I liked mystery books, too. So I read, I've forgotten his name, too. I'm terrible on names. But he wrote mostly lawyer books about mysteries and things like that. And that was, I don't like anything gory.
Gotta keep it clean.
And I like historical novels. You know, a lot of those.
I know, again, growing up, you were always sewing and doing crafts and working with various art forms. But any favorite hobbies that stand out?
Well, of course, painting was my favorite. I studied with Dr. Baum, and we'd take the trolley up to Allentown every Saturday during my high school years, and we did oil painting, and it was fun. I really loved it. Really, I haven't done any since. I did some when we were up at camp in the early years, but then afterwards I didn't have time. We were just down at Ward's, and Daisy said, let's have a day we'll all be painting. So we did. We had a day, all five of us were painting in the kitchen. And we had a fun time. It was a fun thing. We each had to think up our own thing, what we were doing on.
Again, kind of broadly speaking, do you have any regrets, things that you wish you'd done differently, or things you never got to do that you wish you did?
I think I did all the things I wanted to do. I did a lot of things. We had a very busy life, and I don't really think I missed anything that I was really pleased about, that I really wanted to do. Most of our travels centered around art and architecture and history. I loved history. You know, we did a lot. I used to read a lot of history books.
If you had like a general message to like something that you'd want your kids to remember, your grandkids to remember, you know, like what are some like kind of like general, I don't want to say wisdom, but just kind of like things that you've lived by, mantras or ideas?
Just to be gentle and love your kids. Our whole life revolved around our kids, you know, and I think that's important. That just stay with your family and be part of your family. I mean, I consider myself extremely lucky as far as my family goes, you know. With my condition, they all will help, you know. They all help. They're all anxious to help, which is nice, you know. I mean, even the wives of my boys are, in fact, they're more more helpful than some of the boys are. But it's really important to me, and I feel very fortunate, you know, that I have a family like that I'm close to my family, and that they care enough to take care of me, you know, to help me, and that's really important. Adrian tells me over and over again that not everybody's lucky as you. She said some people don't have family, they don't care. You know, family doesn't care about them. And she said, your family cares. And I said, yes, they do. And I think well, they were brought up. We were all brought up very carefully. You know, I didn't have many hardships in my life. You know, and our boys had. Well, your dad had the worst time of it, but he was strong enough to overcome it. You know, and he's all right. He's all right now. And I think that's just the important thing is to be part of your family. I used to say, when the kids were little and the house was a wreck, I'd say, I don't have time to clean. I have to play with my kids.
That's a great quote. Thanks for doing this, Nana. And, do you have any closing words or anything you wanted to say?
Not really. I just hope that it came out all right for you. I'm not very vocal. Verbal.
No, you were great. It came out great.
Okay, very good. Well,